Evolution for Dummies, because I did today, it's going to be very brief, but just very brief talk about evolution. It's really more about getting questions and answers going, and people have problems or kind of misunderstand what evolution is about. I thought I might get some people asking a few questions. At a very simple level, evolution is an explanation that I think is an explanation of the variety of species and life forms that we see on the planet without the need for a designer or a consciousness directive. If we go all the way back to the start of there's various theories on the origins of life, which I'm not really going to go into because it's still a little bit controversial. It's about 3 or 4, but basically, two things you need for life. A way of what's called heredity, which is a way of passing on information from one life form to the next, and a way of reproducing one life form to the next. Reproducing is also passing on the main theory about the origin of life is a molecule called RNA derived through various the laws of physics and chemistry as we know created this thing called RNA, which is a molecule that in the right environment can replicate itself and therefore can be used to pass information. And every time it replicates itself, it represents another generation. Nothing in life is 100% accurate or 100% reliable, so in the same way as a human being transcribing a bit of paper or copying something, mistakes are made. When mistakes are made, we call that a mutation in the code of the RNA. Those mutations usually are pretty detrimental. Once you've got organisms develop a mutation which affects the organism physically in some way, usually has a pretty bad effect, usually fatal, kill the organism, have a bad effect. Some of them are neutral, they don't really affect the organism. And some of them are beneficial in that it allows the organism to survive to the other organisms around it. And whether the mutation has a beneficial effect or detrimental depends upon the environment. So, examples I've put on one of the posters is that there's a mutation in humans that gives you a disease called sickle cell, which if you live in this country is pretty detrimental and makes you really sick. If you happen to live in sub-Saharan Africa, yes, it still can make you sick, but it has a great benefit in that it make you immune to malaria. So in that environment, in sub-Saharan Africa and in populations of people who come from there, it's actually a very beneficial thing. In this country, it has no such benefit, but you won't get the detrimental effects. And over time and over generations, as you get more and more beneficial mutations, in the right environment, they become selected. The organisms with those mutations live longer and have more ability to reproduce, pass on the beneficial mutations. And because these have a physical effect upon the body, you end up over time, this process happens many times, you end up with organisms that are very different, that function very differently than what you started with. And that in a nutshell is evolution by natural selection. Mutations happen at random, but the environment that they're in determines whether they're beneficial or not. The beneficial ones survive. And that is it in a nutshell. So really, I thought that maybe we'd do some questions and answers. Obvious.
Question. Ready? How does the random process for complexity? Don't repeat the question.
Yeah, the question was, if the mutations are random, how do you get more complicated organisms, or how do you get something as complicated as a human being or a cat or whatever from mutations that occur at random? And I think the answer to that is that although mutations occur at random and have a random effect upon the body, the environment and the climate or whatever the environment is tends to be stable for a long period of time. So that is what selects which organisms, which mutations are beneficial or not. So although the mutation happens randomly, selection isn't a random process. It's basically the environment selects the mutations that are beneficial in that environment. Now, obviously, over vast periods of time, climate changes, environment does change, and then you get further evolution because you may have a group of organisms, and one's in one environment, one's in the other, and you get more branching in the evolutionary tree. But I think it's one of the misunderstandings that evolution, the basis of it is random, but the selection isn't.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Go on, sir.
If evolution really is happening, then why is it not happening now? Like, why do we not have monkeys evolving into humans at the moment?
I think it probably is happening now. We can't observe it greatly because of the timescale. We can observe point mutations, one or two, in animals. We can't observe massive ones at the moment because of the timescale. Now, whether in the future you'll be able to see that, because we've got a chimpanzee on video now, and in 10,000 years' time or 10 million years' time, maybe something we can compare it to. But you can certainly see the small mutations that occur. About 50 years ago, a compound called warfarin, which is used as a drug in humans, it thins your blood out, it's an anticoagulant, and it used to be used as rat poison, because you give it to rats and they basically hemorrhage to death internally. And it used to be, the popular, if you bought rat poison, what you get was warfarin. And it doesn't work anymore because there were some rats it was resistant to, that were resistant to the warfarin because of a genetic reason. And as more and more rats that weren't resistant died out, the ones that were resistant became more prevalent in the population, to the extent that now the vast majority of rats are not affected by warfarin at all. So rats have effectively evolved, but there's only one mutation. It isn't a gross evolution that you can see over many millions of years, but it's an example of one mutation in action. What you can't see at the moment is that accumulation of thousands or millions of mutations over time, because there was no one to record it at the time. No one alive who remembers it. Is it still happening? I think it's still happening in animals. Is it still happening in humans? Depends where you are. Depends on your environment. Probably in Western society, probably isn't, because a lot of people who have detrimental mutations that cause genetic diseases in our society, we support them. We have healthcare, provision and things like that. In the wild, they would sort of die out. There may be communities on Earth where that happens.
Do you think intelligent design holds any credibility?
Personally, the question was, does intelligent design have any credibility? I think what it's trying to address is this. Darwin himself identified this flaw in the theory of evolution when the origin of the species, that he called it irreducible complexity. If you could find a mechanism or function in the human body or in anybody that could not have happened with one mutation, that would need several at the same time to happen, that makes it so statistically unlikely that there has to be a designer behind it. It needs to be a plan. Let's put that in. And Darwin himself acknowledged that originally, and intelligent design is a little bit about that. It's kind of an attempt to sort of maybe take religion out of creationism to probably stimulate a bit more debate. There's a lot of scientists, when they see the religious side of it, sort of run a mile. So it's kind of taking the religion, it's just saying designer instead of God, which I think is a fair approach. But it all hinges on, can you find an example of irreducible complexity? There was recently a court case in America because the school board in Dover wanted to teach intelligent design in science lessons. Some scientists said, well, it's not science, it's just creationism with another name. And he went to court, and I think the scientists won. And I personally, I think, I haven't seen, and there doesn't seem to be any, no one's ever really found an example of irreducible complexity that the scientific world has accepted as verified. And I tend to go along with the broad that view, but I haven't found it yet. But I do think it's important, as any good scientist should really think it's important. you've got to look at it. You've got to be prepared to accept it and be fine, accept the implications of it. If someone does find that mechanism, you can't explain it, then you've got to accept it. And you've got to keep your mind open. And any, a good scientist should be able to do that. Take it away. So although I don't think we'll ever find it, I think we should keep looking for it. And it's important that that research is done. Because at the end of the day, whether you're religious, whether you're scientific, somewhere in between, we're all interested in the truth, really. So we just have to.
Is there such a thing as a missing link in human evolution?
Yeah.
I don't think so. In terms of, are we going to find sort of a fossilised skeleton of something that's halfway between a chimpanzee and a human? Then no. There isn't sort of one link. It's kind of an old-fashioned term, missing link, because we as humans like to classify things and label things, so we call these categories of chimpanzee, human. Whereas actually, because evolution works very gradually, you would have all the steps in between. Ourselves and our ancestors are very gradual. I think Richard Dawkins gives a good example of this in one of the books where he says if you could you turn around and you have yourself, then you put your father next in line to you, and then his father, and his father, and his father, and you go back far enough, you'll never find a point where you turn into Homo erectus, whatever it was before Homo sapiens. It will just be a gradual thing, so there isn't one missing link, it's just a continuum of generations. So I don't think we'll ever find one.
If there's no missing link, how do you kind of, like, there's nothing on Earth at the moment, as far as I know, that is kind of halfway in between any species, if that makes sense. Like, there's nothing that could be a chimpanzee, could be a human. Do you know what I mean? So how do you explain that?
There are some.
I better go because I got to get my knees.
There are some. I can't give you exact examples, but there are some where they find skeletons they can't quite decide what classification it falls into. I don't think there's any specific examples of something halfway between, as you say. They often, are you talking about sort of fossils or genetic record?
Well, either really. I've never really seen anything that's convinced me that there's a fuzzy area, if that makes sense.
I think some research published last week about dinosaurs, Tyrannosaurus rex and chimpanzees, that's in the genetic code is the same. That kind of thing. When it comes to fossils, there are gaps in the fossil record. Because the chance of any one thing being fossilised is very, very low. So you're never going to have that continuous spectrum to look at. So a lot of it is filling in the gaps from what you see on either side of a gap. But even if you fill that gap, if you've got one organism here and one organism there, you fill something in the gap, well then there's still a gap between that middle organism and the next one. Unless you had a fossil of every creature that ever lived, you would never have it.
But what about on Earth at the moment, if evolution's still going on? We haven't got this, like, you don't look at a cat and see it gradually change into something else. Like, there's nothing
similar traits, between
yeah, but there's nothing that...
feline.
Yeah.
And, a cat and a lion and a tiger have similar...
But those species have existed, they're just extinct now. That's what you're looking at in the fossil record, isn't it? Species that which are intermediate between two other species, but they just don't exist anymore.
But that's my point, there's nothing that I can see that's like, that could be one or the other.
Cats, there's civet like cats. There are different species which are not like a professional.
But there's
It's
nothing
not real
that...
cheetah.
Cheetah's like a dog. There's claws. You can't retract its claws. It's got like features.
I mean, this example of species actually alive in the head, probably like dogs and wolves, in that they are technically different species, and I can't remember what the criteria is, but they are technically different enough to have a different classification, but they are very similar.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the best one. Off the top of my head, that's the best one.
Well, the cut-bill platypus is another good example. That's a good transitional species from reptiles to mammals.
Yeah.
It's a mammal, but it lays eggs.
The monotremes, they lay eggs.
It lays eggs, and it's got a bill.
It's been isolated in Australia.
But it also excretes milk and feeds its young on milk. So, that's sort of intermediate species, which is currently still around.
They were isolated in Australia, where the sentile mammals couldn't get to it. That's people developed the monotremes.
Yeah, isn't evolution just a theory?
Yes, before you answer that.
Scientific theory.
It depends how you define the word theory, and the general public uses the word theory a little bit differently than the scientific community. There's a word, scientists tend to use the word hypothesis, where lay people use the word theory. Hypothesis being something that is proposed, but they haven't found any evidence for it yet because they need to go through some experiments or whatever. Theory in the scientific world, and the reason it's labelled the theory of evolution, is something that has it's been hypothesised and they've looked for evidence and they've found enough evidence to accept that this is probably right. What science can never say is that something is absolutely right, because you've got to be open to the evidence in the world. So any scientist who tells you this is 100% true is not a good scientist, really. It's just the wrong mindset. But you've just got to be careful when you're using words like theory and hypothesis, because they mean slightly different things in the scientific realm than they do to the lay people. Theory in science is something that has some evidence behind it, but acknowledging that nothing can ever be absolutely said to be proven. So I would say yes, it is a theory, but I'd be careful to define the word theory.
Can I come in there? Because there's a law of gravity, isn't there? There's so much evidence for that. Well, I think in the 21st century, we could call it the law of evolution. Yeah. There's so much evidence for it.
Yeah,
There is evidence for it, yes.
Against it.
But who's to say that the evidence wasn't put in place by a god who's got a sense of humour?
Prove it.
but I think
It's a good joke.
But you know, it's.
I can't say that's not true, but I find that even more unlikely than evolution. You see what
Yeah, I
mean?
know, but you find that less unlikely. But
Scientific evidence for it.
but then you're taking evidence which could be something else.
No, I'm not. I'm taking scientific evidence.
No, you're taking evidence as in the fossil record, which could have been put there.
Well,
It
show
could have been.
how it could be put there then.
It could
Why
have
sure
been,
it's
but
there naturally.
I find that even less likely than the idea that of evolution.
Scientifically.
What would be the point in that?
He's got a sense of humour.
Prove it, show us scientifically.
And also, who's to say that evolution doesn't fall in line with religion, for instance? Who's to say that the creationism story is not an interpretation of evolution?
Because religion's explained by supernaturalism and science explains by naturalism.
Do you mean when you said? Do you mean that evolution was sort of started off, or the world was started off?
Yeah, who's to say that creationism is not a metaphor for
Well, a lot of theists say that. I mean,
the evolution?
a lot
So
of theists say that.
Evolution would not, does not
say that it is.
that there is a God.
no.
And I don't think anyone who, again, I think that's one of the misconceptions. People think that, oh, evolution, people assume it disproves God, or they assume that scientists think.
No, I don't assume that. I'm just making the point that it's just.
Yeah, where did the origin of life come from? As I said before, there's quite a few theories in that. We don't know as much about that as we do about evolution. Where did the universe come from? I don't know. No one knows, but I don't think I'm not qualified. I don't think anyone's qualified to comment on where time and space in the universe came from. Whether you're religious, whether you're scientific, no one can possibly know that. So could God have started off and then evolution took over? I don't have any reason to believe that's how it happened, but I have no proof to say that it didn't. So again, you've got to help.
It's not the problem with that theory that evolution and religion can lie side by side, is that the sheer time scale involved in the amount of evolution we require to get from elementary species to the complicated humanoids we are today is far longer than the Bible allows for in the period of life on Earth. But the Bible generally makes out that the world's between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. And I mean, that's enough for like, not even a change of live. I mean,
Yeah, but then again, you say that it makes out the earliest between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. Fair enough. But also, it makes out that creation occurred in 7 days. But if that's a metaphor over a length of time, then it makes a lot more sense.
Well, that's fair enough, but I think a lot of theists aren't that forward thinking. A lot of theists do still maintain that the Earth is 6,000 years old.
I mean, it depends, because I'm not an expert on scripture or how people interpret it. If we're just saying it's a period of time,
Yeah.
then yeah. But I suppose that depends on an individual's interpretation of that bit of scripture. I mean, my view of it is, from what I know of the science, I don't see a need for a God in that process. But it doesn't mean there wasn't. I can't say that. And could it be a metaphor for evolution? I suppose it could be, you know, just to make it sit. But Are you saying therefore that the person who wrote Genesis originally knew all about evolution?
Well, not necessarily, but the whole hypothesis behind the Bible was that it wasn't written by a man, it was written through them by God. So, I'm sure he'd know about it. That's the, you know.
So it's God's metaphor. So it's God's metaphor through man.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I can't say it wasn't.
Yeah.
I don't see a need for it. I don't see a need to look for God. I think the explanation is good enough without looking for God behind it. Other people would disagree, and I think it's going to be one of those questions of whether we'll ever have an answer to it.
My other problem with that sort of theory is that you're making what is a relatively sound theory more complicated, and the whole point of science is you make it less complicated. So by saying that evolution is in line with God, I mean, God is an unnecessary feature of evolution, so why there's no reason, unless there's evidence, to say he has any involvement in it. So it's an unnecessary complication to a standalone theory. It's not necessarily scientific. I mean, it's not necessary. It's like saying that, you know, every action has an equal opposite reaction, and it makes cheese. I mean, it's a totally unnecessary side part. I mean, it's.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, no, it's kind of an explanation as to why evolution would happen, because we can see that evolution does happen, but there's nothing saying why this. How can this actually happen?
The why
you can explain what happened, but you can't explain why.
Random mutation within control.
Yeah, but how? Why would things randomly mutate? That's the thing. What was it? Sorry.
Are you different from your parents?
Yeah, I know what happens, and I can see why it happens, but I don't know what makes that happen. That's what science doesn't answer. Well, exactly. But just to be so sure about it before you know the answer.
It changes, the wind changes, you know, air expands, clouds form, rain forms. I think.
Yeah, so why?
Because things change.
Yeah, I know there's no explanation for it.
Cells will change, and that will change bigger things.
I know stuff changes. I can see things change. Of course they do. But why?
Because
it does.
Are you saying that the explanation,
Chemical reaction.
The explanation is enough for the moment? There's no concrete theory as to why, like, the Earth happened and why things are changing now. So you can't completely discount that.
Why do you
what you say is, I mean, why things work the way they do.
Why that?
The laws of physics in